It must have been late May or early June of 2020 that I happened upon a forum post that would profoundly alter the trajectory of my life. A quite innocuous post, to all appearances, but one which, for personal reasons, struck me as conspicuous. I used to hang around in a Gnostic message board online. It wasn't really a frequent thing, and I forget how it started. It isn't like me to spend time in online communities, so the fact that I was there at all is a bit odd in retrospect. I used to go there and answer the questions people would post. I really had no right to be doing this. I was practically illiterate on the subject. But people who weren't seemed to think that I wasn't, and they seemed to like my answers. So I kept coming back because there wasn't much else to do at the time. This is a depiction of Abraxas, a spirit who was often depicted on ancient Gnostic amulets. I began contemplating this image around that time. I liked it, and I didn't know why I liked it. And I could feel it talking. I could feel something alive in it, something that knew it was being looked at. One day, somebody made a post asking a very simple question. They were asking about Janus, the two-faced god of the Romans. The question was something to the effect of, are there any deities in any Gnostic pantheon that would seem to correspond to Janus? This post garnered no real attention, and I didn't think I could answer it. But I thought somebody should. I didn't like when people's questions went ignored, so I did my best to find an answer. Janus is the god of thresholds. He is the god of entrances and exits, beginnings and ends. He thus was held to be above the other gods, and it's quite easy to see why. Janus was the god of time, time being that which contains all things, life and death, war and peace, order and chaos, etc. Time is the principle which rules over and binds all the others. I recalled that Jung had said Abraxas was a time god. Remembering that, I noticed something else. Janus has two faces, and Abraxas has two snakes for feet, which have two heads. Now, Abraxas has a third head which is above these, but the meaning is ultimately very similar. They're both pointing to a unity either within or above duality. So I said that Abraxas was the best equivalent I knew of, and I explained why. Later on, I decided I wanted to understand where all these answers were coming from. I figured there had to be some system underneath what I was saying, because it all fit together. I was not contradicting myself. I was not making arbitrary assertions or fallacious arguments, and people seemed to like what I was saying. And it didn't make any sense, because I really hadn't read anything. I tried writing this system down, but this wasn't possible. In the first place, whatever I was trying to write was not linear, and in the second, it wasn't even verbal. It was like I was trying to describe music, or explain how to walk. I decided making a picture might be better. Not linear, and not verbal. I figured I didn't know very much, since I hadn't read very much, so it would probably be a pretty simple picture. I was expecting nothing more than a very crude diagram. But that isn't what I made. I made this. And I put Abraxas in the center. This section here represents the timeless world of archetypes. Each ray of light symbolizes an eternal pattern, and what they're shining from is a kind of all-encompassing oneness. But since we can't see what opposites have in common, this oneness is not visible, and so what we perceive is light shining from a void. This section down here represents physical reality, where patterns manifest. Therefore, you can understand this, if you like, as an illustration of God hovering over the waters in Genesis 1. Now, because this world is beyond time, and this world is within time, Abraxas, as the time god, is below this one and above this one. And since he is the god of thresholds, who rules the beginning and the end, I put the nativity on his left and the ascension on his right. It seems like some people think that I think this is God. I don't. Abraxas is the spirit of transition, and there's a couple of ways we can know that's true. For one thing, he's a hybrid. He's a composite creature. I think it's kind of self-evident why that would represent transition. If you look at something like a centaur, it's not a horse, it's not a man, it's both, and so it represents a space between those categories. Abraxas is mixture, and mixture is what occurs at the boundary between this and that. This is why hybrid creatures and monsters were drawn at the edges of medieval maps, because they represent the edge, or perhaps the end, of the world. In one of my earlier videos, I showed that the constellation of Pisces is an image of Abraxas. This does not appear to be intentional, and as far as I'm aware, it's an observation that hasn't been made before. Now, despite the fact that Pisces rules over February and March, it's considered to be the final sign of the zodiac. This is because astrologically the vernal equinox marks the beginning of the new year, and it still does in the Assyrian, Hindu, and Iranian calendars. So zodiacally speaking, Abraxas as Pisces stands at the crossing point between the old cycle and the new. He is the guardian of the threshold. And this shouldn't really surprise us. After all, his name has 7 letters, which add up to 365. The 7th is the last day of the week, the 365th is the last day of the year, and Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac. It doesn't look like coincidence, if you ask me. You can see a very similar thing going on with the month of January, which is named after Janus. The threshold is of course the beginning and the end, so you can put the threshold god in either place. One is at an entrance, the other is at an exit. This symbol is an important one for our times, and I want to show you some signs that this is the case, because my religious experience, which I recounted a year ago in Contact 2020, bears a strong resemblance to those of others, and I think it's important that I draw attention to this. Around 5 o'clock on Sunday, the front doorbell began ringing frantically, but there was no one in sight. I was sitting near the doorbell and not only heard it, but saw it moving. We all simply stared at one another. The whole house was filled, as if there were a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed deep right up to the door, and the air was so thick it was scarcely possible to breathe. As for myself, I was all aquiver with the question, "For God's sake, what in the world is this?" Then they cried out in chorus,
"We have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we sought."
Carl Jung wrote this in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his autobiography. This is the event which, according to him, preceded the writing of the 7 sermons to the dead. Almost all of Jung's references to Abraxas, which I know of, came from the 7 sermons, a peculiar work which Jung wrote, but did not attribute to himself. Instead, he attributed the work to Basilides of Alexandria, a Gnostic religious teacher, who lived and taught in the 2nd century, and whose cosmological system is one of the first places the being appeared. Jung speaks at length about Abraxas in the 7 sermons. Usually he refers to the god as one which encompasses opposites. Sermon 3 makes this clearest of all. It is love and love's murder. It is the saint and his betrayer. It is the brightest light of day and the darkest night of madness. In Sermon 2 he says, "Had the pleroma a being, Abraxas would be its manifestation. It is the effective itself, not any particular effect, but effect in general." Jung extends this even to God and the devil, speaking of Abraxas as a kind of overarching personality in whom the two are contained. Now this is very interesting because it points directly to Jung's astrological hypothesis, which he advances in Ion. That being that in the age of Pisces, the collective psyche was split by a conflict between Christ and Antichrist. These were, according to him, symbolized by the 2 fish of Pisces. There was an implication that in the coming age of Aquarius, this conflict would have to be resolved. I have my own objections to this. I never found Jung's dualism very convincing, but I don't have to go into that, because the next person I intend to talk about had his own reservations about it, and his answer to the problem was exactly the same as mine. Rudolf Steiner is probably one of the most interesting occultists of the 20th century. and unfortunately he doesn't seem to be as well known as some of the others. I'm only beginning to read his work, but he strikes me as far wiser than most of his contemporaries. Despite the eccentricity of his thinking, he still comes across as very astute and sober-minded. Steiner had his own view of good and evil. He believed that evil was not one thing. It was two things, comparable, if you like, to hot and cold. From the human perspective, hot and cold are both dangerous, and there is a small range of temperatures between the two which are not damaging to us. Steiner believed the same was the case in the spiritual world. He identified these two outer principles with Lucifer and Ahriman, Lucifer being the Christian devil, and Ahriman being the evil spirit of the Zoroastrians. Ahriman is associated with darkness, and Lucifer is associated with light, and so it makes sense that they would be opposites, and yet both of them are evil in their respective cosmologies. In the middle of these two he placed Christ. These three constitute for him a cosmic triad. We may contemplate the Luciferic beings in terms of the kind of interest they take in cosmic existence. We find that their chief interest lies in making the world, particularly the human world, unfaithful to the spiritual beings whom we must regard as the true creators of humanity. Their one desire is to make the world disloyal to these divine beings. They are not interested in claiming the world for themselves. They wish to free the world from the beings felt by humankind to be the real divinities. The Ahrimanic beings have a different interest. Their firm intention is to get the human kingdom, and thereby the earth along with it, into their sphere of power, to make human beings dependent on them, to control humanity. In other words, Luciferic beings striving for universal freedom, and Ahrimanic beings striving for lasting dominion, are constantly waging war in this cosmos we are part of. Steiner felt that this threefold scheme was so important that he claimed, "Calling a being the Christ does not make it so. Anyone who wanted to be sure of keeping people from forming a true concept of the Christ would only have to replace the triad with duality." It becomes fairly obvious why he believed this once it's pointed out. If you take this triadic scheme, and you just semantically fold it like this, so that now balance is on the right and imbalance is on the left, you can create the illusion that the middle is here. By making Christ one of the poles rather than the center, we fundamentally alter what he represents. I can play the exact same trick with hot and cold, but because hot and cold are tangible physical sensations and not abstractions, the absurdity of this second misconstruction is self-evident. Now, the cosmic significance of the number 3 can hardly be understated. In most things, we encounter two extremes and an optimal space between them. 3 positions. Notice that Christ taught for 3 years, died in his 30s, and rose on the 3rd day. He was crucified between 2 thieves. Modern scholars now claim that the only astronomically possible date for the crucifixion, assuming the Gospel accounts are accurate, is April 3rd, 33 AD. I said once before that if you multiply any number by 3 and add all the resulting digits until you only have 1, it will always be 3, 6, or 9. 3 numbers. If you add 1, 2, and 3 together, you get 6. If you add 4, 5, and 6 together, you get 15. 7, 8, and 9 add up to 24. And if you did this forever, the sum of the resulting digits would always be 6. Starting with 1 through 6, the sum of the digits will always be 3. And if you do it starting with 1 to 9, the sum will always be 9. Only 3, 6, and 9 do this. 9 is particularly interesting. I should first point out that 9 is 3 sets of 3. Now, circles have often been used to represent the universe. The Taijitu is a circle, the Ouroboros is a circle, lots of mandalas are circles, electrons circle atomic nuclei, the Earth circles the Sun, and the Sun circles the galaxy. Circles are comprised of 360 degrees. 3 plus 6 plus 0 is 9. Half of 360 is 180. 1 plus 8 plus 0 is 9. Half of 180 is 90. 9 plus 0 is 9. 4 plus 5 is 9. 2 plus 2 plus 5 is 9. 1 plus 1 plus 2 plus 5 is 9. 5 plus 6 plus 2 plus 5 is 18. 1 plus 8 is 9. 2 plus 8 plus 1 plus 2 plus 5 is 18 again. I think you get the point. So you see, we have to be clear that a realistic view of the structure of the cosmos requires us to recognize the role that the number 3 plays in it. Now, as far as I'm aware, Abraxas does not feature in his philosophy. But all this bears a striking resemblance to the theology which my cosmogram laid out. Here, the right foot of Abraxas is the serpent of the tree of knowledge, and the left is the Gnostic demiurge. The serpent is associated with freedom, being on the rising side of fire and air. The demiurge is associated with restriction, on the descending side of earth and water. If you look at the head of Abraxas, you'll see I put around it a cruciform halo. From any orthodox perspective, this is blasphemy. You're only supposed to put these on Christ. But the idea behind it was that Christ was the third and highest force in a triad, which I was using Abraxas to depict. So both triads are basically identical. The only major difference between what Steiner said and what I just said is that he identified the restrictive principle with a different being. However, this is a depiction of the demiurge, a serpent with a lion's head, and this is a statue of Ahriman, a winged man with a lion's head and a serpent wrapped around his body. It was once believed that this character was Zervan, the ancient Persian god of time. However, one thing is quite certain. Several of these statues have been found with dedications to Ahriman inscribed on their base. It strikes me as entirely possible that what the Gnostics were trying to depict on their amulets was this same entity, but due to technical limitations, the figure had to be simplified. But that's just speculation, and I can take or leave it. Even the objective similarities are uncanny, and these two systems were created independently. I'm not exactly sure how Steiner arrived at this idea, but it certainly looks like it had nothing to do with Abraxas. For my part, I just noticed that Christians and Gnostics had both represented their devils as snakes, each of which represented a different side of the same conflict, and that Christ seemed to represent the resolution of that conflict. Then I noticed Abraxas had 2 snakes for feet, and so the whole scheme just seemed self-evident. I didn't know anything about Rudolf Steiner when I made this, and yet he described precisely the same triad as I have, and he did so more than 100 years ago. In addition to all this, Steiner believed these beings incarnated. Lucifer, he believed, had been incarnate in the 3rd millennium before Christ in the East. Christ, of course, had his incarnation about 2,000 years ago, and he believed Ahriman was going to have his in the West around the beginning of the 3rd millennium. This human being would be the Antichrist of Revelation, and this entity, according to him, would be the author of a vast scientistic deception. I can't help but feel he was onto something. And I find it fascinating, because Jung's book, Ion, which predicts the coming of the Antichrist at about the same time, has this on its cover. It may be surprising to some that the clearest parallels of all with Contact 2020 are to be found in the life of Aleister Crowley. In order to discuss this, it is necessary to briefly summarize what happened to Crowley and how he came to establish his occult philosophy. According to the account, it began in Cairo on a honeymoon with his then-wife, Rose Kelly. It was in March of 1904 when Crowley claimed that he performed a ceremony called the Bornless Ritual. This with the expectation that sylphs would appear before the eyes of his wife. This apparently took place in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Though Rose did not see any sylphs, she supposedly entered a light trance and said to her husband, "They're waiting for you." Rose later identified Horus as the one who was waiting. Crowley was skeptical because Rose knew nothing of magic or Egyptian religion, and so he asked a series of questions about the god. Rose allegedly answered all of them correctly. When asked to point to an image of Horus at the Bulak Museum, Crowley said that Rose walked without stopping to the stele of Ankh-F-Khonsu. This object did in fact depict the correct god, and was housed under inventory number 666. On April 7th, following these events, rose on behalf of an entity called Iwas, the messenger whom Horus had supposedly sent, instructed her husband to record what he heard between noon and 1 p.m. in a particular room of their apartment for the next 3 days. Following these instructions, Crowley, at the appointed place and times, heard a voice coming from above his left shoulder. It dictated to him the contents of the text, which would be named the Book of the Law. The book proclaimed the dawning of a new Aeon, the Aeon of Horus, the crowned and conquering child. It seems probable to me, and I'm certainly not alone in thinking this, that Crowley was attempting deliberately to trigger the apocalypse of the Book of Revelation. Crowley identified himself as the Great Beast 666. One of the deities in Thelema is Babylon, the prostitute who rides the beast. The crowned and conquering child, for his part, seems to be a rather transparent allusion to the crowned and conquering first horseman of the apocalypse, a figure variously named Pestilence, Conquest, and Antichrist. Crowley himself seems to have suggested the same in his confessions. Indeed, my falling away from grace was not occasioned by any intellectual qualms. I accepted the theology of the Plymouth Brethren. In fact, I could hardly conceive of the existence of people who might doubt it. I simply went over to Satan's side, and to this hour I cannot tell why. Let's take a look at what this experience has in common with my own. Crowley claimed that the text of the Book of the Law was dictated to him by a superhuman intelligence. Likewise, I have claimed that my cosmogram was designed according to specifications dictated to me by a superhuman intelligence. Crowley's experience begins with the Great Pyramid of Giza, and connects the pyramid through a synchronistic event with the number 666. My experience ends with the Great Pyramid of Giza, and connects the pyramid with 666 as well. However, in my own case, this number was found encoded in the dimensions of the monument, and I certainly didn't put it there. Again, the pyramid's perimeter and height correspond to the equatorial circumference and polar radius of the Earth at a scale of 43,200. 6 plus 6 times 6 times 600, or 72 times 600. 72 being the age at which Aleister Crowley died. How is it that the number 666, in connection with voices heard in the Great Pyramid, should later be found hidden in the dimensions of the structure? Shall we call this coincidence? Horus himself, need I point out, is a bird-headed god from Egypt, and the central figure in the Book of the Law. Abraxas is likewise a bird-headed god from Egypt, and the central figure in the cosmogram. Superficial as that may be, it doesn't strike me as a very probable accident of chance. The Book of the Law announced the dawning of a new Aeon, the Aeon of Horus. Contact 2020 likewise announced the dawning of a new Aeon, the Age of Aquarius. Crowley furthermore had an important relationship with an entity who took the form of a cup-bearing woman, that being Babylon, who carries a chalice full of the blood of the saints. Likewise, a tremendous amount of my own experience came through an entity who took the form of a cup-bearing woman. Her name was Zell. She was called the Lioness, and was the keeper of the Holy Grail. In the end, however, there is one very important difference between the two. Crowley's revelation and spiritual system are decidedly anti-Christian, drawing either from pagan myths or incorporating the antagonists of Revelation. But mine isn't like this at all. It actually took me a long time to notice all these connections, because at the level of bare aesthetics, the two stories look nothing alike. But having seen the parallels, I find them utterly baffling. It were as though this experience is a response to this one. At any rate, all these signs point in the same direction. I think now you're finally ready to see it. What I'm going to show you next is the most fascinating and terrifying thing I have ever seen with my physical eyes. It's something I found in April that I did not want to reveal until I had made the due preparations. The second cosmogram, or I suppose the first cosmogram. This is a picture made by someone else, a person with whom I have no contact. It was made years before I made my cosmogram, and I swear that I never saw it until 2021. Remember that in my image, Abraxas is mirrored. Symbolically, this is supposed to be the reflection of the viewer. This is something I said back in March in the 4th video I made. So basically, his left is your left, and his right is your right. Now look at these two images. Of course, Abraxas is in the center. At either side there are pillars, and if you look closely you'll find that the artist used almost exactly the same Corinthian columns as I did. Above Abraxas there is an eye with light shining out of it. The top of my image looks like an iris, and this is by design. The left foot of Abraxas is the Gnostic demiurge, and the right foot appears to be the Edenic serpent. These snakes are coiled in such a way that the shape quite strongly resembles a taijitu. Underneath Abraxas there is a circle with foliage coming out from behind it. You can see that on the left side of Abraxas there is downward motion indicated by the hand with the whip, and on the right side there is upward motion indicated by the hand holding this orb. I have attempted to create the same sense of motion with this line. And notice that the whip is in the left hand, and the demiurge is the left foot. You can also see that the sword in the middle, along with the eye and these symbols on the wings, form a cross, whose middle is the head of Abraxas. This image was made 5 years ago, in 2016, and the name, which the artist goes by, is Corvid. I don't want this person contacted or harassed on my account. I just want to show you what I found. Because I managed to find Corvid on Instagram. Events are about to unfold the likes of which no generation has ever seen before. These are just the first rumblings of a storm on the horizon. I trust all of you have heard it for yourselves. This story is ending, and we should all be preparing for that. The signs have never been more clear. But take heart, because there is a note of hope in all this. Subtle threads, which nobody perceived until now, are beginning to come together. Let there be no question about it. These things do not happen by accident. This has been the most destabilizing experience I've ever had. I feel like I just fully recovered from Contact 2020 a month ago. And all this past year, I had the feeling that this stuff was beginning to slow down. It was starting to feel like I'd been dumped. But looking over everything I've just written, and bearing in mind all the things I haven't said, it's clear to me that it's not winding down at all. If anything, it's accelerating. I just got used to it. And it all keeps coming together. Not in a strained or random way, but in a way which makes sense, and possesses a great clarity of meaning and intent to those with eyes to see and ears to hear. I have the utmost confidence when I say, this is not a mirage. I'm not hallucinating. I'm not talking nonsense. And I'm not lying. In all I have said in the service of this work, I have tried to make it as clear as I can that God was among us as Jesus of Nazareth, born of a virgin, crucified and resurrected. And if I had not been told that by the thing I met in 2020, I would not now believe it. I was asked to pass that along, and vast mysterious forces with supernatural capacities have decided to help me do that. Have conspired to bring you here and tell you exactly which side they're on. I do not see signs like these coming from those who say otherwise, nor do I believe I will. Be not afraid, and keep faith in the days ahead, and the world to come will belong to you. I thank you all for being here. I'm very grateful that you are. It's been an honor and a privilege to do this. I hope I will get to continue for a long time to come. Once again, I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you for watching, and be well.